History remembers the portraits. The high collar, the pearls, the defiant bee pendant resting against a swan-like neck. We remember the romance that broke a church and the king who burned the world to possess her. But history has a way of scrubbing the blood off the scaffold to make the past more palatable. Today, we step out of the golden light of the court and into the long, damp shadow of May 19th, 1536. Forget the sanitized dramas. Forget the quick flash of steel. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a psychological torture chamber, a masterclass in state-sponsored cruelty, and a scene of such visceral horror that even the hardened spectators of Tudor London felt the air turn cold. You think you know how she died. But the truth of her final moments is far darker, far more intimate, and far more agonizing than you could ever imagine. The psychological disintegration of Anne Boleyn began long before she reached the scaffold, trapped within the very walls that had once hosted her greatest triumphs. For 17 agonizing days, she was held captive in the Tower of London, specifically within the Queen's lodgings she had occupied just before her coronation. The cruelty of this choice was intentional, forcing her to confront the ghost of her former glory while facing a future of certain annihilation. Every shadow in those rooms whispered of the crown she had lost and the betrayal of a king who had once promised her the world. The walls did not offer the comfort of a sanctuary, but acted as a suffocating reminder of her meteoric fall from grace. She was a woman caught in a temporal trap, existing between the memory of a queen and the reality of a condemned prisoner. The atmosphere within her chamber was thick with a calculated mounting dread that gnawed at her sanity with every passing hour. Outside her window, the rhythmic, metallic thud of hammers echoed through the stone courtyard as workmen labored to construct the wooden stage for her death. This was not a silent anticipation, it was a loud, industrial countdown that vibrated through the floorboards and into her very bones. She was forced to listen to the literal carpentry of her own demise, a sound that transformed the air into a heavy, unbreathable weight. Each nail driven into the timber was a heartbeat she would never get back, a physical manifestation of her approaching end. The psychological torture lay in the inescapable nature of this noise, a constant jarring reminder that her life was being measured in planks of wood. As the days bled into one another, Anne's mental state fluctuated between a frantic, high-pitched hysteria and a cold, hollowed-out resignation. She would burst into fits of laughter, marveling at the smallness of her neck, before collapsing into bouts of weeping that terrified her few remaining attendants. This was the result of a mind being methodically crushed by the weight of state-sponsored isolation and the unpredictability of her fate. She was surrounded by female jailers who were not there to comfort her, but to report every whispered word and every sob back to the king's council. Even her prayers were not private, as her spiritual life was monitored for any sign of a confession she refused to give. The isolation was not of the body but of the soul, leaving her utterly alone in a room full of enemies. The king's refusal to set a firm time for her execution added a layer of refined sadism to her imprisonment that felt almost supernatural in its cruelty. She would prepare herself for death in the grey light of dawn, only to be told that the executioner had been delayed or the king had not yet signed the final warrant. This liminal horror kept her in a state of perpetual shock, preventing her from finding the peace that usually comes with a definitive end. She was forced to die 1,000 times in her mind, rehearsing her final walk and her final words until they lost all meaning. This was a psychological meat grinder designed to break her spirit so completely that she would be a hollow shell by the time she reached the blade. The uncertainty was a weapon used to strip away the last vestiges of her royal dignity and human resolve. By the final night, the transformation from a vibrant political force to a sacrificial lamb was complete, leaving her in a state of haunting clarity. She spent her last hours in a vigil that was less about piety and more about the sheer survival of her identity against the crushing pressure of the state. The horror of her situation was the realization that her life had become a mere political transaction, a debt to be settled in blood. She was no longer a wife or a mother or a queen. She was a problem to be solved with the swift stroke of a foreign sword. As the sun began to rise on her final morning, the psychological siege had left her fragile yet strangely incandescent. The meat grinder had done its work, leaving behind a woman who was ready to embrace the cold steel just to escape the agonizing weight. The decision to employ the Sword of Calais was a terrifying innovation in the history of English executions, introducing an eerie, foreign precision to the scaffold. Henry VIII rejected the traditional heavy-headed axe of the Tower, which often required multiple gruesome hacks to complete its task, in favour of a specialised Flemish weapon. This choice was framed as a final mercy for a queen, yet it carried an underlying current of exotic horror that unsettled everyone involved. The executioner himself was a man of dark renown, summoned from Saint-Omer specifically for his ability to sever a life with a single, sweeping arc of steel. By bringing in a professional from across the sea, the king transformed a state killing into a bespoke piece of high theatre. This weapon was not just a tool, it was a symbol of absolute power that could reach across borders to find the perfect ending. Unlike the clumsy block used for an axe, the sword required Anne to kneel upright in a posture of agonizing vulnerability and physical discipline. She had no wooden structure to lean against or grip for stability, forcing her to hold her own torso perfectly still through sheer force of will. This lack of a block meant that her neck was completely exposed, a slender target suspended in the open air without any room for error. The executioner did not stand behind her like a hidden shadow, but moved around her with the grace of a predator, calculating angles. This forced intimacy between the condemned and the killer turned her final seconds into a silent, high-stakes choreography where any flinch could lead to disaster. The horror lay in the requirement for the victim to participate in their own clean death by remaining as motionless as a marble statue. The sword itself was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, a double-edged blade designed to slice through bone and sinew with the effortless speed of a whisper. It was longer and lighter than a broadsword, tapering to a point that could find the narrowest gap between vertebrae with chilling accuracy. Because it was so sharp, the air would literally hiss as the blade was swung, a sound that would haunt the memories of those standing on the front lines. The executioner kept the weapon hidden beneath a mound of straw or behind his back until the very last moment to prevent Anne from panicking. This secrecy added a layer of psychological dread, as she knew the steel was there, somewhere in the periphery, waiting to materialize. The blade represented a new, modern era of killing where the violence was sanitized by its own efficiency but amplified by its coldness. The theatrical precision of the French swordsman created an atmosphere of breathless, sickening tension that felt entirely different from the rowdy spectacles of common hangings. The crowd did not see a masked, hulking figure, but a man dressed in fine silk who treated the act of decapitation like a delicate surgical procedure. Every movement he made was calculated to ensure that the Queen's blood would flow in a specific direction, away from his own expensive clothing. There was a perverse elegance to the way he measured the distance with his eyes, a professional gaze that stripped Anne of her humanity. To him, she was not a fallen sovereign or a former lover of a king, but a technical problem involving the resistance of the spine. This clinical approach made the act feel more like an assassination than a legal punishment, heightening the sense of a grand, tragic betrayal. Ultimately, the exotic nature of the sword served to alienate Anne from her own people even as she stood on the soil of her own kingdom. It was a weapon that didn't belong in London, wielded by a man who spoke a different tongue, creating a sense of total displacement. This foreign intervention ensured that her death would be remembered as something unique, a singular event that stood apart from the mundane brutality of the Tudor age. The sword offered a clean cut, yet the psychological weight of such a specialized death was far heavier than a simple blow from an axe. It was the ultimate expression of Henry's paradoxical love and hate, providing the best possible tool to destroy the woman he had once cherished. The Sword of Calais did its job with terrifying perfection, leaving behind a legacy of a death that was as beautiful as it was barbaric. The walk from the Queen's apartments to the scaffold was a final, grueling gauntlet of public humiliation disguised as a royal procession. Anne emerged into the morning air wearing a robe of dark grey damask, a sombre and heavy fabric that seemed to swallow the light around her. Beneath this, she wore a kirtle of deep crimson, a colour traditionally reserved for the robes of martyrs, signalling her final, defiant stance to the world. Her choice of clothing was a silent, visual sermon, communicating her innocence and her readiness for sacrifice without her having to utter a single word. Every rustle of her silk against the stone was a heartbeat in the collective chest of the gathered, trembling crowd. She moved with a strange, ethereal grace, as if she were already a ghost, walking among the living, haunting the court before she had even left it. The horror of this walk was found in the suffocating silence of the spectators who had gathered to witness the fall of the great whore. Unlike the rowdy, jeering crowds that typically attended public executions, the people of London stood in a state of paralyzed collective shock at the sight of her. There were no cheers of triumph and no cries of lamentation, only the heavy, damp sound of boots shuffling in the mud and the distant caw of ravens. This vacuum of sound created an atmosphere of profound isolation, making Anne appear as though she were walking through a dream or a different dimension. The eyes of her former subjects were not filled with hatred, but with a terrifying realization of the king's absolute and unhinged power. The silence was a physical weight, pressing against her as she ascended the steps, making the small distance feel like an infinite journey. As she reached the scaffold, the sensory details of the scene became a visceral assault on her remaining composure and the nerves of the onlookers. The smell of fresh-cut timber and old, blood-soaked straw rose to meet her, mixing with the salty tang of the nearby Thames and the scent of fear. She was surrounded by the very officials who had orchestrated her downfall, men who refused to meet her gaze as she stepped onto the platform. The platform itself was draped in black, a void of color that stood in stark contrast to the vibrant green of the tower's lawn in springtime. This juxtaposition of life and death, of the blooming season and the cold machinery of execution, amplified the unnatural cruelty of the moment. The texture of the rough wood beneath her feet served as the final transition from the soft luxury of the palace to the hard reality of the grave. Anne's final speech was a masterpiece of political tightrope walking, delivered with a voice that remained steady despite the looming shadow of the blade. She did not use her final moments to scream her innocence or curse the king, knowing that such a move would only bring ruin to her daughter, Elizabeth. Instead, she spoke with a hauntingly polite submission, praising the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, while the subtext of her words dripped with irony. The horror lay in the absolute necessity of this lie, a final act of service to a crown that was in the process of murdering her. The crowd listened with bated breath, searching for a crack in her armor, but she gave them only the polished veneer of a queen. This was her final performance, a display of royal dignity that made her executioners look like common thugs in comparison. The transition from the speech to the physical preparation for the strike was a moment of intimate, agonizing vulnerability that stripped away the last of her royalty. Her ladies-in-waiting, weeping uncontrollably, stepped forward to remove her mantle and the iconic bee pendant that had come to define her image. They tucked her hair into a simple linen cap, exposing the slender, pale neck that had been the obsession of a king and the pivot of a revolution. This act of undressing was not about modesty, but about the cold, functional requirement of the executioner to have a clear, unobstructed path for his steel. As she knelt down, she was no longer the centerpiece of a kingdom, but a target of flesh and bone, waiting for a predator's strike. The visual of the queen, reduced to a kneeling figure in a cap, remains one of the most haunting images in the annals of history. The psychological finality of the execution was centered on a masterclass of deception designed to prevent the natural instinct of a human to flinch. Anne was not allowed the traditional blindfold of a commoner, as the upright posture required for the sword necessitated that she remain perfectly balanced and aware of her surroundings. Instead, the blindfold was a metaphorical one, constructed out of misdirection and the executioner's expertly timed movements to ensure a clean strike. She was forced to face her death with open eyes, staring into the middle distance of the tower courtyard, while the world dissolved into a blur of grey stone and weeping faces. This lack of physical covering meant she had to witness the glint of the sun on the steel if it caught the light, adding a layer of visual terror. The executioner knew that a moving target was a dangerous one, so he turned the final seconds into a game of sensory manipulation. As Anne knelt in the straw, her lips moving in a rhythmic, desperate prayer for her soul, the headsman began his chillingly calculated performance. He did not simply step forward and strike. He utilized a technique common among the most skilled French swordsmen to trick the victim's nervous system. He began to move his feet loudly on one side of her, intentionally drawing her auditory attention and her focus toward the left. This was a psychological sleight of hand, making the condemned believe the danger was coming from a direction it was not. By manipulating her perception of space, he ensured that she would subconsciously tilt or steady her head in a way that offered the best angle for the blade. The horror lay in this intimate betrayal of her senses, where her own ears were used to lead her neck toward the edge of the sword. The executioner's voice then cut through the thick, expectant silence of the crowd as he shouted, "Boy, bring me my sword," while he was already holding it. This vocal decoy was the final piece of the trap, intended to make Anne think the weapon was not yet in his hands or that he was across the platform. Hearing this, she likely felt a momentary, agonizing reprieve or a confusion that caused her to settle into a more rigid, unsuspecting stillness. In that precise heartbeat of uncertainty, she wasn't bracing for the impact because her mind was processing the false information he had provided. He was standing directly behind her, his movements as silent as a shadow despite his vocal outbursts, preparing the heavy arc of the swing. The deception was a mercy of the most brutal kind, keeping her mind occupied with a lie until the very second the steel met her skin. The speed of the actual strike was so immense that it outpaced the human ability to process pain, creating a vacuum where life used to be. Because she had been tricked into looking away, the blade arrived as an invisible force, a sudden and total termination of the physical world. The horror here is the absolute isolation of that final thought, a woman expecting a delay but meeting a definitive cold end. There was no time for a final scream, no time to register the betrayal of the man standing over her, only the sharp hiss of the sword. The trickery ensured that the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain on the scaffold was preserved, even as it was being violently stolen. It was a clinical, quiet erasure that left the onlookers breathless at the sheer, terrifying efficiency of the deception and the subsequent kill. This psychological mind game elevated the execution from a mere act of state justice to a refined piece of lethal performance art. It revealed a deep understanding of human anatomy and fear, using the victim's own biological responses against them to facilitate their destruction. For the witnesses, the trick was a haunting display of how easily a human life could be snuffed out when professional skill was applied to the task. For Anne, the deception meant that her final conscious experience was one of being misled by the very man paid to end her suffering. The blindfold of sound and movement was more effective than any piece of cloth, stripping her of the chance to face the blade head-on. In the end, she died in a state of manufactured confusion, a final indignity orchestrated to make her execution as perfect as possible for the king's record. The most haunting aspect of the execution was the visceral reality of what occurred in the immediate seconds after the sword passed through her neck. Medical historians and contemporary witnesses have long pointed to the beheading interval, a period where the brain remains active despite being severed from the body. Because the sword of Calais was so sharp and traveled with such incredible velocity, it did not cause the massive trauma or immediate off switch that a blunt axe might have. Instead, the sudden loss of blood pressure did not instantly deplete the oxygen already stored within the neural pathways of her brain. For a few agonizing moments, Anne Boleyn's consciousness likely persisted, trapped within a falling vessel that was no longer connected to a heart. This creates a picture of a woman who was technically dead to the world, but still sentient within the dark confines of her own mind. As her head tumbled into the scarlet-soaked straw, the witnesses standing closest to the scaffold reported a sight that would haunt their nightmares for a lifetime. They claimed that her eyes did not roll back in a vacant stare, but continued to move with a frantic, searching intelligence, darting across the crowd. It appeared as though she was trying to process the impossible perspective of the ground rushing up to meet her and the sight of her own headless torso. There was a sickening sense of recognition in those eyes, a silent witness to her own physical termination that defied the quick mercy promised by the king. This persistence of the self after the body has been discarded is the ultimate horror of the decapitation process, a biological lag that forces the victim to observe their own end. The straw was not just a landing place for a corpse, but a witness to a mind still flickering with the last sparks of life. The horror intensified as her lips continued to move in a rhythmic, mechanical fashion, seemingly finishing the prayers she had begun while she was still whole. Witnesses swore they could see the formation of Latin words, a ghostly echo of her final plea for mercy that transcended the physical severing of her vocal cords. Without lungs to provide air, the movements were silent, a grotesque pantomime of a woman still trying to communicate with a god she was now meeting. This involuntary or semi-conscious reflex suggested that the motor cortex was still firing, desperately trying to complete the last task it had been assigned. To the onlookers, it looked as if the Queen were trying to speak from beyond the veil, her spirit clinging to the flesh with a terrifying tenacity. This was not the peaceful sleep of the dead, but a frantic biological struggle to remain present in a world that had already moved on. Modern neurobiology suggests that a human head can retain a form of consciousness for up to 30 seconds after decapitation before the final blackout occurs. During this window, the face can display expressions of shock, pain, or even a profound localized confusion as the remaining neurons fire in a final chaotic burst. For Anne, those 30 seconds would have felt like an eternity, a sensory vacuum where the sounds of the crowd and the smell of the blood were still being processed. The trauma of the strike would have sent a massive surge of adrenaline through her system, perhaps even heightening her awareness in those final, fleeting moments of existence. The psychological horror of being a severed head is a concept that transcends historical era, touching on our deepest fears of being trapped within our own dying anatomy. It was a private, internal hell that no one standing on that lawn could truly comprehend or alleviate. Finally, the contortions of her face in the straw served as a grim rebuttal to the idea that her death was a clean or painless transition. As the last of the oxygen was consumed, the muscles would have spasmed in a final, silent scream or a grimace of absolute terminal agony. This was the moment the Rose of England was truly extinguished, her features twisting into a mask of death that bore no resemblance to the beauty that had captivated a king. The executioner eventually reached down to lift the head by its hair, presenting it to the crowd as a trophy of state justice and a warning to all. Even then, as the blood drained away, the remnants of her last expression remained etched into her skin, a permanent record of the violence she had endured. The persistence of her consciousness turned a quick execution into a slow, internal torture that remains the most gruesome chapter of her story. The final indignity of Anne Boleyn's life was the absolute and chilling lack of preparation for her physical remains after the blade had fallen. Despite the months of legal maneuvering and the vast expense of the executioner, the Crown had failed to provide even a simple coffin for a queen. As her body lay cooling on the scaffold, leaking its royal life into the thirsty straw, the officials realized they had no vessel to contain her. This was not a mere oversight, but a final, structural act of erasure intended to strip her of any lingering dignity. She was no longer a person to be honored with the rites of the church, but a piece of evidence to be disposed of. The woman who had reshaped a kingdom was left exposed to the elements, while guards scrambled to find a solution. In a move that bordered on the grotesque, the men-at-arms finally produced a common elm chest that had previously been used to store arrows. This was a crude, functional box of war, never intended to hold the delicate form of a woman, let alone a sovereign of England. They unceremoniously gathered her body, still dressed in the crimson and damask of her final performance, and forced it into the narrow wooden frame. Because the chest was too short for a human form, her head had to be tucked awkwardly beside her torso in a cramped, unnatural position. There was no shroud to wrap her in, no linen to wipe away the gore of the decapitation. Only the rough wood and the smell of old iron. This packing crate became the final throne for the woman who had once worn the crown of St. Edward. The burial itself took place in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a cold and shadowed place reserved for the disgraced and the forgotten. There was no funeral procession, no tolling of bells across the city, and no grieving husband to offer a final prayer over her remains. She was carried like common freight across the Tower Green and lowered beneath the heavy stone flags of the chancel floor. The men worked in a hurried, functional silence, eager to enter the evidence of the king's latest whim and move on with the day. No marker was placed to indicate where she lay, leaving her in an unmarked subterranean void alongside the very men she had been accused of loving. This anonymity was a secondary execution, a deliberate attempt to make the world forget that Anne Boleyn had ever existed. For centuries, she remained in that arrow chest, a secret hidden beneath the feet of congregants who walked over her without ever knowing her name. The horror of her end was completed by this total silence, a state-mandated oblivion that lasted until the Victorian era. She was denied the grand mausoleums of the Tudors, relegated instead to the damp earth of a prison chapel where the light rarely touched the floor. This was the ultimate victory for Henry VIII, who wished to see her not just dead, but utterly deleted from the physical landscape of his realm. Her final resting place was a site of trauma rather than peace, a shallow grave that served as a warehouse for the victims of the Tudor machine. The Queen of England had been reduced to a footnote buried in a box meant for the tools of death. Even in the modern era, when her remains were eventually rediscovered and identified, the memory of that packing crate remains a stain on the history of the monarchy. It serves as a visceral reminder of how quickly the highest in the land could be reduced to the status of refuse. The contrast between her coronation at Westminster Abbey and her interment in an arrow chest is the most profound arc of tragedy in British history. She went from the heights of a golden throne to the depths of a discarded box in the span of only 3 years. The horror of her execution didn't end with the sword. It was immortalized in the cold, cramped silence of her final, unceremonious burial. Today she rests under a marble slab, but the ghost of that elm chest still lingers in the shadows of the tower.